floral gin, savory gin, pink gin, blue gin. All of them are gin, but are they gin? My name is Aaron Knoll, author, botanical spirits historian, and member of the Gin Guild. And today I'm with a great panel of American distillers and gin industry professionals to ask the question, how little is too little juniper for a gin to be considered a gin? So now I'd like to invite the team to introduce themselves. I'll pass it over to Jason.
So my name is Jason Barrett. I'm the master distiller and warden rectifier here at Black Button Distilling in Rochester, New York.
Melissa and Lee.
Hey everyone, Melissa and Lee Katrincic. We're Durham Distillery US in North Carolina. We are makers of Katrincic gin, and we are both members of the Gin Guild.
Maggie.
Hey, I'm Maggie Campbell. I'm the founder and principal at Half Pint Co-Creations and two-term board member at the American Craft Spirits Association, as well as the representative for the WSET Alumni Advisory Board member for all North American graduates.
And last but not least, Stephen.
I'm founder and master distiller at Gould Distillery, and I am a warden in the Gin Guild.
So to begin, James Heyman, distiller for Heyman's Distillery, published a manifesto in 2018 on fake gin. He said, and I quote, "Recently we have started to see some distillers marketing gins that have little to no juniper character. Such products undermine the work that the vast majority of distillers complete and run the risk of misleading consumers by blurring boundaries between gin and other spirit drinks." So to begin our conversation, what exactly is the line? When is a spirit with juniper no longer a gin? Stephen, if you wouldn't mind taking this tricky question first.
You know, Europe and the US had different laws, but I think we need to look at historical precedents. And historically, gin has been a juniper-centric spirit. That doesn't mean there's not room for innovation. That doesn't mean there's not room for a wide interpretation of what gin is. But there does come a point when if the juniper disappears into the spirit and other botanicals are the pronounced character of the spirit, I would argue it's no longer really a gin. You know, I do a fair amount of judging for various organizations, IWC, World Drinks Awards, etc. And one of the things that I tend to find a lot of European distillers doing is what I like to call an orris bomb. And they get so much orris in the gin that really the juniper starts to fade away, and it almost begins to taste like a floral, like a creme de violette or something. And at that point, I would argue that's a flaw and it's no longer a gin. But I can tell you, having judged with some of the top gin distillers in Europe, that opinion is not shared by a lot of other distillers. So, you know, it really comes down to, I'm going to say personal opinion of the distiller, but within a framework. And I would go back to, it's got to have a juniper character, or it's just no longer a gin. Doesn't have to be hugely juniper, but the juniper needs to be present and needs to be heard, so to speak.
Right. Maggie, what is your take on when is a spirit with juniper no longer?
I agree with Stephen quite a bit. For me, if there is not a core element of juniper, it's no longer true to style for myself. It serves a different purpose. It has a different profile. It has a different identity, because this is a big question about what is identity, what is true to style, and what is a flaw. For me, I tend to define a flaw as going beyond the intention of the producer. So a producer might intend for their gin to be really low on that savory element. But for me, if it doesn't have a core element, an identifying element of juniper, it belongs to a really beautiful category of, you know, some of these Geist method eau de vies, which I think we struggle with in the US is under brandy in our laws, there isn't a lot of room for this Geist method brandy where you would take fruits or, you know, in this case, sort of a Geist method herb and fruit spirit and macerate and redistill and capture those aromas. In our system, there isn't really that same honoring of that classical style. So I think something that could perhaps remedy a lot of these issues is a respect and category for these Geist method eau de vies, that they tend to fall more under the category of, and they're beautiful and should be respected, just like they are in the Black Forest of Germany, but they are inherently different than having that core of juniper.
Right, Melissa and Lee.
Yeah, 100% agree with Maggie and Stephen. Yeah, contemporary gins are kind of the primary gins you're going to see in this country, and we need to make sure that we are staying true to gin history, basically. And I know a lot of these are regionally driven as well, and in this country. And I would assume that you start having juniper as the fourth and fifth botanical in your botanical load, then you're really not making a gin.
Right, Jason.
So I definitely agree with my esteemed colleagues, but I also think I look at it slightly differently, only from the consumer side rather than the producer side. So consumers tend to drink gin in some very classic cocktails, gin and tonic, martini, aviation, bee's knees. And to me, as long as the gin juniper component still plays well in those cocktails, where the consumer might get a new experience, but the experience they expect, then it probably has stayed inside what I would consider gin. But I definitely agree to the statement that there are starting to be products at the fringe of the definition. And unfortunately, we don't seem to have good definitions for those products. So they're getting lumped in with gin when possibly some of them should be called something else if we could be a little more specific as an industry. So hopefully that's something we'll see over the next few years as opportunities for folks to make that differentiation and promote their products the way they probably would like to.
Right. You mean, and juniper is traditionally the core part of gin, and it's core part of the definition. But I think one of the very interesting things about gin, where it differs from other spirits that are clearly defined by ingredients or process, a lot of our definitions center around taste, and taste is, well, a little bit harder to be absolutely objective about.
Very
Maggie,
subject.
would you Maggie, would you be able to share a little bit about, like, what are some of the real rules in place in the United States and abroad about what makes gin technically a gin, legally speaking?
Yeah, and it's interesting for me because I have experience in the rum category, and when you read the US laws about rum, it has to have the character of rum. And so it is sort of, you know it when you taste it. I know it when I see it, is what we say here in the US. And there aren't, the same rules in the EU around rum here in the US. It has that character and nature. So that's a world I feel very comfortable in, is, am I being exploitative or authentic to this? And if it falls outside of this, there's no shame in that. It is just something else. And that's kind of what I was speaking to as well. So yeah, I think for me, managing in and around it should, in the laws, it's saying, it should have this note of gin. I feel like honoring that is something that is consistent across the globe and throughout the experience that I've seen at its core. Around all the nuance, around all the noise, I feel like there is still something at the heart of it that I see globally. But, maybe one of you guys disagrees with me, but I feel like in rum, there's a lot more variation. What is considered a agricole by law, by rules, is different than what's considered a Jamaican rum by law, by rules. And then here in the US, it says, has the character of rum. That's much more vague than the gin laws, I feel.
Right. And I also think an interesting thing a lot of you alluded to, which is kind of categorization. I've talked with distillers who are like, I'm worried about making a spirit because if I don't make a gin, it's going to be on that corner shelf where they put all the liqueurs, the absinthes, the things that consumers don't necessarily go to. Is there flexibility? Like, is there an opportunity to make botanical spirits a broader, more acceptable category beyond just gin?
If we had direct to consumer shipping and marketing, we wouldn't have to rely on being stuck in the corner where no one can find our products. If we had the ability to control just being able to sell the products we make to the people who want it. I think people don't understand that's illegal here. That would change people's ability in how they're thinking about how this works. I don't know if anyone disagrees with me there or agrees with me.
Well, I definitely think you see some of it in the tasting rooms. There's a really great distillery in Portland, Maine, that actually distills carrots, and it's a carrot botanical spirit, and it has a nice juniper note. And they've made the conscious choice not to call it a gin because the carrot element adds some real complexity. You can really only find it in their tasting room. Yeah, you really don't find it in a wider market, because although in their tasting room they can explain those differences, as we were just discussing, it doesn't unfortunately have a place in a traditional liquor store shelves that are going to allow it to be a really successful product.
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, I'm known for making a lot of weird, odd stuff. And the challenge is, how do you make money making the stuff that's fun to make, that's unique, that's different? Maggie brings up a great point that direct to consumer would allow us, the industry, to be able to reach out and touch consumers around the country with products that your traditional wholesalers and retailers probably either would put on that corner shelf or may simply never carry, because it's not high volume. It doesn't move quickly enough. I applaud people that want to do weird things, but I get distillers that ask me all the time, I want to make this really unique spirit. And more often than not, I have to tell them, look, what are you going to make to keep the lights on? And the challenge for all of us is making a beautiful spirit that's unique enough and different enough that it differentiates us from the distillery down the street, or the distillery, or any of there's 5 distillers on this Zoom. None of us wants to make the same product, and we all want to differentiate ourselves from each other. But at the same time, how do you get a product that has broad enough appeal that you can get it onto the liquor store shelves, you can sell it, and you can actually make a living off of it, which then does facilitate making the little niche products that are fun that you can sell elsewhere.
And that's part of what encourages people to maybe classify as gin when it's not necessarily a gin, to avoid, like you said, that dark black hole in the store.
Yeah, and I would even add that we see regionally in the Southeast that we would have more success if we were actually more so calling ourselves flavored vodkas. We get on shelf easier as a flavored vodka than we do as a gin. So the gin shelf, the buyers in the Southeast of the United States, they're not expanding their gin shelves. It is what it is. And so we have to figure out how we can actually create differentiation, but also stay true to the historical category of gin, because that's where our passion is. It's just really interesting to see the trend line of our consumers, and hoping that they're also improving their palates as the gin category grows.
Right. And I think that's a great point, right? The gin category has not exploded stateside in the same way that it really has in Europe. Some people even see the modest growths in gin year over year, suggesting the United States might be ready for the gin boom. We might be looking for our moment where gin is taking off, and the United States is a very regional place, right? The Northeast has very different drinking preferences from the Southeast. And that's something that I think, until you really come to the United States and travel our vast country, it's kind of hard to really see. We're really many nations within a larger space. So taking it back to gin and the great work I know everyone on this call is doing, Melissa, could you tell me a little bit about what is your team doing with Juniper? How are you working with it? And tell me a little bit about your gin.
Yeah, so I'll open up a little bit and then have Lee take over, since he is our master distiller. So Conniption Gin has 3 different styles: an American Dry, Conniption Navy Strength, and then we now have our barrel aged series that started with its first launch in Q4 of 2020. Very different styles from one another, very different botanical loads, and it is also driven by, as Jason mentioned before, that cocktail versatility. What did we want to see in terms of the Conniption American Dry Gin? How would that play in cocktails versus our Navy? And really backing into it that way. So it's been an exciting thing to see the journey of consumers as well as on trade and our cocktail programs as they expand. But down to the nuances, I'm going to pass that to Lee. Oh, and I almost faded there.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so our American Dry Gin, as Melissa mentioned, is our contemporary offering. We use, we vacuum distill honeysuckle flowers and cucumber and blend it into our gin base that comes off the pot still. So we do a kind of, we call our operation a marriage of art and science. So we're using modern science, vacuum still, the art, the old pot distillation to make our gin. So American Dry will have cucumber, honeysuckle. It's blended into the gin base off the pot still with juniper, cardamom, coriander, angelica root, fresh orange peel. Our Navy Strength gin is a different style of gin. It's more savory, whereas the American Dry we consider fresh and floral. The Navy Strength is more of the a gin lover's offering, where I used a lot of juniper adjacent botanicals in that gin. So it's going to be big juniper, coriander. There's also rosemary, bay leaves, and it's balanced out with caraway. And we've also vacuum distilled dried mission figs to help round that gin out as well. We started a barrel series, so we are doing a barrel release. Our first series was we got a hold of some bourbon barrels from High West Whiskey, and we aged a variation of our Navy Strength in those barrels for about 10 months, and we just released that in October. And our plan is to have fun with it, and each year try to release a different series with different barrels and see what fun we can have.
And from the back to the juniper question, it really is for us ensuring that whatever we create in terms of a new gin style, that the juniper has a predominant flavor, because that is, we do have a passion for this category, but can figure out with the gin wheel, what are the elements that we really want to have carry forward onto the palate when someone tries the gin neat. And that has really been an exciting project for us, is to hone in on what those strategies and what those flavor profiles can be individually.
Right. You know, it's always inspirational. Like, you can describe your gin as fresh and floral while still having juniper predominant and at the heart of it.
Right.
Jason, tell us a little bit about Black Button and your work with juniper.
So our mainstay is our citrus forward gin. So it is a little bit lighter on the juniper, but that still is the #1 botanical in the product. And then we end up using a lot of fresh orange peel. Luckily, we found little automated machines to do that peeling, because in the early days it was quite an endeavor. But that's a very kind of well-rounded gin that's just not a traditional London Dry. We make a seasonal gin called our Lilac Gin. Rochester is known as the Flower City for our Lilac Festival. And so distilling with flower petals fresh each year. It's really a very light and delicate gin. And then we have also tried our hand at various, either like a raspberry forward gin or a barrel aged gin ourselves. We just recently finally launched our take on an American Dry gin. It was actually pioneered by my partner, Jeff Fairbrother. It is your more traditional juniper heavy, classic cocktail, gin and tonic type of gin. But we worked on that for about 4 years before we were ready to bring that to the market. And it's still, we would say it's heavy juniper for us, but I imagine if we went to London, we would find it on the light side for UK gins. So just an American take on it.
Right. Stephen, tell us a little bit about Golden Moon and how you work with juniper.
There we go. So here at Golden Moon, we do 2 core gins for ourselves. We do a variety of limited production gins, and then we develop formulas for distilleries around the world. So we've probably done, at this point, maybe 40 different gin formulas in the last 6-8 years. Our flagship Golden Moon gin, several years ago, now I acquired a cache of pre-prohibition spirits and carboys that had been stored since pre-prohibition. And there was a carboy of 1880s medicinal gin, and I tasted it, and I wasn't making gin at the time, and it totally blew me away. I'm glad that I then that was, my partner sold that off. And I went back, and without having that to taste, I started looking at how historical gins were built. And I was making absinthe, I was making whiskey, but I very quickly realized, looking at botanical bills from the 17 and 1800s, that absinthe and gin were very closely related, far more so than I think I'd consciously realized. So I started experimenting, and we developed a very herbaceous, very thick, nice floral notes gin. Not a huge botanical bill, only 7 botanicals, 9 ingredients total. And that, to this day, is Golden Moon Gin, our core offering. Very heavy on the lavender. Nice citrus notes, despite the fact there's no citrus in it, because we use other botanicals that give us a citrus note. Our second offering is we take that exact same gin and we put it into freshly disgorged California port style wine casks, and we age that out for about 6 months. And those are the 2 core offerings. We've done another derivative that was sold by that boutique gin company, which we dried out a little bit, if you will, added a little bit of spice to it for the UK market, and that's that boutique gin company's Expeditionary Gin. And of course, it says Golden Moon on it. And then we've done a variety of releases for ourselves. The other thing we're getting ready to do is we're getting ready to launch a large format bourbon rye and gin under a new brand called Old Blackhawk. And Old Blackhawk gin is a little more citrus forward. Again, a pretty small botanical bill, distilled here at Golden Moon. A lot more lemony character, using dry lemon peel and a little dry orange peel in the herb bill. But in all cases, we're pretty heavy-handed with the juniper, not as much as some British drinkers might like. It's not a juniper bomb per se, but it's on the heavier side. And everything in the Golden Moon is 45 ABV. Everything in Blackhawk is 40 ABV. And then we're actively developing and getting ready to produce gins for a company in Greece and a company in Mexico. And those, of course, will be very, very different. In Greece, for example, we're rolling some oregano into it. And I'm kind of excited to we've gotten some prototypes that are really intriguing. It's not quite where I want it yet, but it's where we're going. In all cases, we use a combination of European sourced juniper and locally wildcrafted juniper from here in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains.
Right.
And if anybody's been to my distillery, when I teach botanical classes, I make everybody walk into the parking lot and harvest their own juniper berries off of the big Utah juniper outside my front door. And the first thing they do is crush those, macerate those, and distill those. So,
yeah. And it is a beautiful juniper tree you have out front of your distillery. And I think it's really interesting, and kind of worth reiterating. At the beginning, we all talked about, like, we are on a call of people that really believe in the value of juniper and gin. And yet when we talk about our gin products, we're often talking about these other botanicals. Sometimes there's a perception that because we've made a lavender or a citrus or a savory gin that we're forgetting about the juniper. Yet here we are talking about it in these contemporary terms while still heating the heart of the category. So we've kind of talked about what we're doing, what we're putting out for the market. Now I kind of want to just talk about, like, maybe experiments, maybe things that didn't go out there. What's the most interesting gin project you've worked on? Maggie?
Oh man, I've gotten to be at a couple distilleries and give some good technical advice on different ones. For me, I worked in a spice house in college. So I have a really kind of different background coming into gin, in that, we are always, this is why you want a Zanzibar clove for this dish, and this is why you want a Ceylon clove for this dish, and this is why you want this cinnamon for pastries, and then this cinnamon for savory, like Moroccan meatballs. Like, why would you want different spices for which flavors, and what do they harness? And so for me, like, that is something I really, really kind of get into, layering together, like, well, how savory do you want your juniper to show? Or do you want to bring forward some of the sweetness? And if so, then we might want to go this way. And then also, I think one of the things that a lot of other distillers contact me about is I worked at a distillery where we did an unfiltered gin, and we used some really cool techniques from the Black Forest and just some traditional ways of working the equipment to make really specific kind of cuts and the way we handled the product, so we could leave it unfiltered and it didn't loosh or get cloudy with ice. And so we could leave in full texture. And for me, having that background in the spice house and knowing, this nutmeg is from Grenada, this, this allspice is from Jamaica, and then also having the background in rum, I always like to really highlight that we often erase like where these ingredients are sourced from. We say London dry gin and you think of London, you don't think of, the colonialism and the trade that created this style. And so it's been nice to kind of recenter that in some of the discussion about where these spices come from and kind of singing their praises as well. And it was really interesting to me when Christoph Keller, the founding distiller at Monkey 47, who's, very famous for his very rare eau de vies, kind of discussed when he did his experiments and got really intense lab readings, he found that it was cane neutral spirit that affects the aromas like the most brilliantly for him. So I kind of thought that was like a natural little connection too. So getting to think about how gin allows me to talk about other things is kind of fun. But I would say the unfiltered technique, when I kind of put that together and did it the first time, and I did the final proofing the first time and it worked, it was like a moment of magic and fear kind of working out. So
I love when experiments work out. Jason, have you done any interesting experiments with gin?
So we've had the opportunity to do some experimenting with vacuum distillation, never with a product that's come to market because my vacuum still is like half a liter. So you are making gin like one bottle at a time. But in terms of products that have actually come to market, I've really enjoyed layering in both those floral and those fruit aspects, because we found we have to distill those at a lower temperature to not end up getting like a vegetal note. And so it takes longer to run the still that slowly, but combining, you're almost getting ahead of the cocktail where you're bringing some of those fruit or floral flavors in with the gin in the bottle instead of just at the cocktail. And that's been a lot of fun, as well as getting to try stuff from not only the folks on this panel, but many of the other great craft distillers here in the United States.
Right. And, and I do look up to all of your gins and all of your distillation. I love the work that you all do. I'm curious though, who do you as distillers look up to? Are there any distillers or distilleries that you think are really doing great things with gin or juniper? Melissa, Lee?
Absolutely. So I think in the United States, full credit to Lance and St. George. I mean, to create gins that have such amazing personalities and really that cocktail applicability, I've always admired that distillery and of course that distiller. So I'd say that first and foremost, if you're a U.S. gin distiller, that's who you go to kind of look at the history of how it's evolved in the United States. There's definitely, I'd love to see the regionality of what's happening in the US, the gins that are made in the Pacific Northwest versus Stephen making it in, Colorado, even to the Southeast. We are trying to bring in some terroir without making it just overwhelming into the specific botanical wheel, right? So it's the nuance of what the region brings to the gin. And then if I look outside of the US, I have always admired Four Pillars, what they are doing in terms of just kind of pushing the envelope in gin, but still retaining that gin flavor, that juniper personality, and just how we've seen that country just go so far into consumers loving the gin category. And I think Four Pillars has really set that standard for that country. And I look forward to all of us collectively in the US gin distillers finally doing that for our consumers.
Right. And, and kind of along the lines of what you said, Maggie, like I'm impressed. Four Pillars really celebrates the local province of their botanicals, right? Australian botanicals are all over their gins, and they celebrate things that, stateside. I don't think I knew what a finger lime was 5 years ago, to be honest with you all.
That's right.
Yeah.
Stephen, are there any distillers or distilleries you look up to or think are doing really interesting things right now?
I'm going to echo the comment on Lance. Terroir was one of his older gins. He really wanted to get the experience of standing on Mount Tam over San Francisco, and just his ability to be able to translate that into that gin. I mean, I've always kept a bottle of it on my home bar, and my home bar is rather large, but there's not room for everything I want. That gin in particular has just always blown me away that he was able to do that. Starting not from gin, but starting with whiskey and then going down the absinthe rabbit hole. When I started to explore gin, there were gins I looked at. And I've got a soft spot in my heart for Junipero, which of course was Anchor's take on a London Dry. And it's sort of like a London Dry on steroids. I mean, it's this big, huge, in your face version of a London Dry. It's just a lot of fun. And then, I know, as we all do, a lot of gin distillers around the world, and there's people that kind of stick out and impress me. And a lot of them are friends. So yes, I'm going to give a few kudos to some friends of mine. Dr. Ann Brock, she's been with 2 different gin distilleries now, and she is just so incredibly talented. And a lot of the stuff that she experiments with will probably never see the light of day because she's at Bombay and they're a big company and they only release a few expressions. But she's got an amazing palate and a unique understanding at the chemical level of what makes up the various conjugars. And she does some really cool stuff. The other person that I think has done some really fun things. It's a guy named Tim Stones down in Australia. Tim grew up, if you will, as the brand ambassador for Beefeater, and then moved to Australia because that's where his wife's from, and was the distiller at Manly Spirits, where he started playing around with things like wildcrafted seaweed from the Manly Peninsula. And now he's building another distillery, and he's done a bunch of odd little gins that some of which probably never have left either distillery, but he's just got a really deep feel for unique botanicals and an amazing palate. And just some of the stuff he's done is just cool and interesting and fun. And it may not have wide market appeal, but it's fun drinking it.
I also really love his work. I guess I have a soft spot for Australian gin in addition to American gin. I really love the innovation there. And speaking of innovation, I'm going to kind of bring us back a little bit to the core of both the convo and gin, juniper. So going back to like a little bit on the consumer side, one of the key tenets of Hayman's manifesto was these innovations risk misleading the consumer. And over the past decade plus, we've kind of seen the industry attempt to self-regulate with the creation of these new informal gin designations. So contemporary, new American, international, new Western, the list goes on. So has gin become a broader category? What is kind of its future in the market from a consumer perspective? Melissa, Lee?
I think that is an amazing question to kind of take a stock of what's going on in 2021 with the consumers and even our on-premise colleagues, in the cocktails and bars in the country. If I look at pre-pandemic where we were and where the consumer and what their drinking evolution was looking like, it was really exciting because I think we were on that cusp. We were seeing that broader gin category, the flavors coming out, the exploration, the education was also really picking up. And it wasn't just that we were seeing it in our colleagues in bars and restaurants. We were seeing that with who was coming into the tasting room, who wanted to explore gin tasting in a whole new way, like learning the history of the category as well as then what was going on in the United States. And so I am very hopeful that that is also going to continue post-pandemic, but I think we've hit the pause button in some ways. If I look at what we're faced with in terms of challenges right now in our buyer, let's just talk about the off-premise buyer of gin. The imports of the new expressions coming from the United Kingdom and from Europe are much easier to get shelf space than your United States gin distilled gin. It is really hard to be in this sort of in between right now of consumers who want to explore the gin category, but are giving credence and more affinity towards things that are not distilled in their own country. And so I think we have a perception problem that we need to figure out as gin distillers in the US, that there is amazing things that we are doing collectively. And we need our consumers as well as our on-premise colleagues to recognize what we're bringing to the table, instead of giving 5 flavor variations out of an Italian gin. I'm just going to put that out there, right? So, it is this dichotomy that I would love us to be able to progress through. I think gin as a broader category in the US has so much potential. And I think you see that in terms of the data. But we have some hurdles in front of us for education for consumers, and education for our on-premise, and even for our off-premise for our buyers. Because I don't know if any of my colleagues have gone to a gin shelf regionally lately and seen how the mix match of how they present gins. But there is a real lack of understanding, even with that off-premise buyer, on how to build their gin shelf. They've put that energy into their bourbon and their whiskeys and their ryes, but they have not done that for gin. And I think we really have to, as an industry in the United States, work on that education, and really how that's going to be the pinnacle that helps us get through the next phase.
Right. And it's very interesting, the Italian distillery you mentioned, those gins are wildly contemporary, pushing the boundaries of juniper content. They're flavored gins. So it's not just that outside brings more gin character, right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Maggie, what do you think about gin as is gin becoming a broader category?
I mean, I still think that even with so much of the experimentation, I still readily recognize much of the gin as I would recognize gin, granted, coming from my perspective and context as a, smaller scale distiller in the US. So I run, the judging chair for the American Craft Spirits Association competition. So we see a world of gins come in every year, and we're always considering how we're flighting them and putting them together and what we're seeing. And yeah, I do think it's growing. I do think that there's some innovation. I do think there's some that straddle the line of, if only we would embrace a different category that could allow them to maybe not necessarily brand themselves as gin, or if we had a system that didn't punish them for not branding as gin in the marketplace, maybe they would be better suited to that. And we tend to flight those together as well. But I do think that there is some breadth. We saw a lot of really fruity flavors come out. We saw a lot of really, spicy, spicy tones come out. Now things are going really herbal and savory. And so it's been really interesting to see that trajectory as well. I think a lot of people opening new distilleries, which we all know is an extremely hard challenge, gin becomes a very good go-to. And I think that for a period of time, maybe 10 years ago, that meant that maybe it was a lot of new distillate that was gin. And I think we had a moment where maybe people were thinking gin had, some issues. And I think we've really grown past that. And what I'm seeing today, it might be broader and it might be more complex, but I recognize the vast majority of it as being very ginny, to Jason's point, suitable in a gin cocktail, recognizable in a gin cocktail. I think that's an important thing, is if you put that in front of someone, would they even recognize it as that thing? And that's really, for me, is it true to style? And I'm seeing that they are still gins, even if they are broader and have a lot of breadth to them.
Yeah, and the cocktail thing comes up frequently. Jason, I'd love to hear a little bit more. What do you think about gin as a broader category?
So it's definitely one of the most exciting times to be in gin. I think, to Melissa's point earlier, it's amazing how old school the industry is as a whole, and I know everybody on this panel has heard it, well, if you're making whiskey, it must come from Kentucky. If you're making rum, it must come from the Caribbean. If you're making gin, it must come from England. And so there's still that regional piece that we have to really fight against across all categories. I think cocktail bars are definitely driving a whole new wave of innovation. I think cocktails at home in the pandemic are driving a whole new range of innovation. I think ready to drink cocktails. I mean, I was fortunate enough to study in Scotland in college, and you could walk into a grocery store and they had a Pim's cup and a gin and tonic and 6 different things just ready to go, as easy as we would have a 6-pack of beer in the bottom of a cooler. And we're just starting that here in the United States, where really 2 years ago, getting canned cocktails was very difficult. And it's still just at the very beginning. But I think all of that will contribute to redefining what gin is in this country.
And, and redefining gin is very interesting. Stephen, I tried your gin first a long time ago, and I remember this is contemporary gin. That was what I think I said the first time it is. So I'm curious what you think. What do you think about gin as a broader category and these informal designations?
I regularly hear people, as recently as yesterday in the tasting room, that walk in and say, oh, I don't like gin. And my comment is, in reality, and you never want to say this to a consumer, but I think in my mind, that person didn't like the one gin they tasted. Gin is not one spirit. Gin is a huge, broad family of spirits that have one thing in common. And this goes back to defining gin, and that is that they are a juniper-centric spirit. But once you've gotten past that juniper-centricness, now you can do all kinds of different things. And, sometimes I'll do cocktail classes and I'll bring out 5 or 6 gins, including my own, including, depending where I am and who I'm doing it for, maybe different styles of gin, maybe all different craft producers from different distilleries in the region, etc. And I'll have people make the exact same cocktail with the different gins and figure out which gin and which gin flavor profile actually fits appropriately for that cocktail for the people making the cocktail. Because all you need to do is change the gin, and even though you may have whether it's a martini or a Martinez or any of hundreds of other gin cocktails, you change that one ingredient, the gin, or for them, or change the vermouth or any other. But as soon as you change one ingredient, you've got a different cocktail. So I think what we're going to start seeing here in the US, I hope, which we've seen for the last 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 years in Europe, is people starting to go out and experiment a little bit with what gins fit with what they like to drink, as opposed to just thinking in their mind, as most American consumers do, oh, that's just gin. Now, the thing I worry about is we could go too far, and you've seen this in the UK, and you've seen this in Spain, where you get gin bars that have 500 gins on the bar, and the average consumer walks in and goes, I haven't tried this one, I'll try this one. And the brand loyalty starts to crumble a little bit. So I'm hoping we never get to the point where gin becomes commoditized and it's, I'm going to try this and then go on to the next one. But that American consumers, and this is education that we need to do on our part as gin distillers, that American consumers begin to realize that gin is more than just gin. Gin is a family of gins that has a huge broad spectrum. Now, I realize most of the people that are going to be viewing this are probably people that already get that, but that I think is our biggest challenge. And that goes back to what Melissa started with. We've got to do a better job, and it's a never-ending challenge of educating our consumers on what gin is and what gin isn't, and what each of our brands of gin is and how it works and how they might best enjoy it.
Right. Ultimately, everything lives or dies in the hands of the consumer. They're the ones who are going to decide what they're drinking. And, and I think it is always inspirational to hear, like, I think that those opportunities that you present in tasting rooms, right, to inspire someone who said, I don't like gin because they had that one cheap plastic bottle 20 years ago and they've written it off. You know, my mom is one of those people. She's a huge fan of Black Button Gin. She lives in upstate New York. She buys all of your products, Jason. You've converted her. But I see the opportunities like that. So just in closing, anyone else have any big visions for where's gin going in the United States in the next 5 years? Lightning round. What's your quick hot take? Where are we going? Melissa and Lee.
Oh, we get to take that first. I mean, we're going to take it over, right? I think that I really do. I have hopes that with consumers as well as our bars and restaurants, that the journey that we're all taking into the flavor categories of gin, to presenting the options for cocktail applicability, that the palate progression of our demographics we're gonna hold their hand and get them there. And I can't wait until we just feel like, we're not constantly as gin distillers saying that gin is flavored vodka, because that is still that head blown emoji for our consumers when they're in our tasting rooms, that they aren't making that connection yet. And that is the connection. That's the through line. This is a Tito's driven country. And if we can get them into flavors, I think we've got them.
Yeah, it's been nice on a little micro scale to be able to see people come into the distillery when we first opened, and just really have sworn off gin, as we've all talked about here. And then as we've gone on over the years here, more and more people are just coming back, and I think they're turning people on to it. So hopefully we can all do that on a broader scale.
And I love when we get I love gin. Do you guys get it too now? Like, I love gin. And it's just like the secret society. I can't wait for it to be shouted from the rooftops in the United States.
Jason, Stephen, do you get that?
We're still getting a lot of people that have I had gin once in college and I don't like gin. What I find interesting is that many of those folks then order gin cocktails. And so I really think RTDs will be the catalyst that will introduce folks, I like this canned cocktail, and if it's made with gin, maybe I should try gin in a different way. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
We kind of get both experiences. When we opened our tasting room, Golden Moon Speakeasy here in Golden, over 7 years ago now, Golden is a very big beer town. I mean, the world's largest single site brewery is right around the corner, Molson Coors. We have a population of 17,000. I think we have 7 breweries now. So it's a pretty beer-centric kind of a place. And so we offered, what we were trying to build was a world-class cocktail program, which I believe we've succeeded in doing. And it had almost half the cocktails were gin cocktails. And people kept telling us, no one is ever going to come and drink high-end cocktails, and certainly not gin cocktails, in your speakeasy. Well, we're pretty much at capacity right now, most nights. Now with COVID restrictions, we're at 50%. It's a tiny venue, but we have people that are regular gin drinkers now that come into our venue because they've experienced it in the tasting room, and that have totally changed the way they drink. Now, the challenge for me as a brand owner is, how do I translate that from my tasting room to the world? But it's a great experience.
And Maggie, where do you think gin in the next 5 years? Where are we headed right now?
I'm excited to see a lot more discussion around sourcing. I think consumers have much bigger questions about the health and safety of the workers in the field. Distilling has always been tied to farming, and farmers are going hungry. And especially, some of these really technical people who specialize in growing these spices. So I think as much as we're seeing a lot of questions about sources of base ingredients, I think we're going to see a lot more discussion around where spices are sourced from. And, when we were talking about some of the pioneers we really admire, Todd Leopold from Leopold Brothers was the first distiller I met who was like, oh yeah, no, our stuff is freely traded. They knew where their spices were coming from in a meaningful way. And I really enjoyed hearing that way back in the day. We're talking, a couple of years before St. George had installed their gin basket. I think it's cool that people have been thinking about it for a long time, but it's not something I as a producer ever get asked about. And I see that's coming, especially with more consumer awareness around where things are from.
Yeah, I look forward to the world that you've all painted, and I'm very excited about where gin is going stateside right now. It's just amazing that within this legal description, spirits with a main characteristic flavor derived from juniper berries produced by distillation or mixing. That's legally what we say in the States. The wealth, the mass of creativity and expressions that can exist within that while still respecting kind of juniper. I want to thank our panel for sharing their experiences, their expertise. I want to thank our listeners for tuning in. And, I wish you all a juniper-filled day wherever you might be. Thank you again for listening, and cheers.